Last week, we made a distinction between descriptive claims and normative claims. In fact, we made another set of distinctions because we talked about what a claim is, right? Remember, a claim is anything that's grammatically complete, and that could be true and that could be false, right? So it's making a claim about something, and you can evaluate it for its truth or falsity. So we put aside questions and commands and exclamations and things of that nature, which are uses of language but aren't claiming anything. And among claims, we made a sub-distinction. So descriptive claims have the following form: X is the case, and normative claims have the following form: X ought to be the case. And in a normative claim, you're not so much describing the way the world is, you're describing the way the world should be. Right? You're saying, okay, I realize that the world is the way it currently is, but here's how it should be. Kind of like if you're looking down at a weight scale and you see that you weigh 80 kilos, but you say, I should weigh 70 kilos, right? The fact that you weigh 80 kilos is what it is. But nevertheless, you don't have to take that and accept it. You can want to say, hey, look, the world should be different from the way it currently is. And that's a guide to our actions, right? So when we're moving forward in time and we face decisions, so there's a fork in the road, and you can either choose option 1 or you can choose option 2, and that's you over here, and you haven't chosen yet between option 1 and option 2. You haven't chosen yet, so that's in the future. And what's going to guide your choice between those two things can't possibly be reality as it currently is, because reality as it currently is in the present. It's the situation you currently occupy, and you're deliberating about what action to take in the future, right? And the future is not here yet by definition. So you haven't undertaken the action. You're confronted with a choice. Should I do 1 or should I do 2? And it's a should, because you have a genuine choice there. You're facing a fork in the road, right? And studying this part over here, right? Studying this present is not going to tell you what the future should look like. And the future is going to follow the natural laws of nature and whatnot, but your decisions are something else. Your decisions are answerable to, your moral character and your free will. And so you got to sort that out. And that's what ethics is concerned with, right? So that's what we did last week. And a big takeaway was that ethics as a branch in philosophy is not concerned with what we do, but what we should do. And so the normative claims in studying in ethics can't be justified empirically. That is, you can't just turn to observation, but they still have to be justified. So it isn't because they can't be justified empirically that all of a sudden they can't be justified. So like, no, right? This X over here, if I put an X on empirically, yes, that's appropriate. It cannot be justified empirically, but they still have to be justified. That's still a thing. So how do we do that? Well, we do that with arguments, right? So to justify is to argue, to give reasons for what one claims. And that's the sort of stuff we're studying, right? These diagrams. And that we put in language. It isn't about me, it isn't about you, it's about the reasons that we can write down and we can all study. And importantly, reasons mean nothing if they're not examined, and they're there merely to confirm what we already think or feel. Like clearly you're going to come into any issue with an emotional disposition to think such and such, right? But that emotional disposition, that's psychology, that's not philosophy, right? All it tells me is about, your upbringing or your personal preferences, but it doesn't track truth. Why should I believe that your preferences and your emotional dispositions track truth? That's not a reliable guide to wisdom at all. And so what we philosophers try to do is we try to write stuff down, give reasons, right? And we stay open-minded, because reasons that we give will mean nothing unless we're actually prepared to say, hey, this is where they're taking us and that's where I'm going to go. I say, okay, look, I'm going to get past my emotions and my personal preferences. I'm going to start reasoning. And I'm going to evaluate reasons in general, right, for what I ought or ought not to do. What's the structure of that going to be? Well, fundamentally, the structure is going to be this. This is an argument, right? It'll have 2 premises, premise and a premise and conclusion. Given this relation here, is this a relation of dependent or independent support? Yeah, good. The premises are lending dependent support to the conclusion, right? So we know what that means. It means you can't just go from one premise to the conclusion on its own. That won't work, right? You can't just go from either premise to the conclusion on its own. This is a relation of dependent support. And so what that means is you'll have a premise, you'll have another premise, and those 2 premises will jointly support the conclusion. Now, the general form of this of reasoning in general is just argument. So here I'm saying the structure of moral reasoning. Moral reasoning is a form of reasoning, and reasoning will have the form of premises and conclusion. What's specific about moral reasoning is that what you're going to have as premises are as follows. On the one hand, you'll have a general principle, and, so this is the strong and of logical conjunction, both are required. You'll have a particular case, and then those two things, the general principle and the particular case, are going to support a conclusion. So therefore, and the conclusion is going to be called a judgment. So it's going to let you judge what you ought or ought not to do. Now, the things I want to point out here are the words general and particular. So what I mean by general is what's going to figure on the left-hand side of this argument structure is always going to be worded in a way that's more general. So the concepts that are going to figure in there are going to be able to pick out multiple instances because they're going to leave out a lot of detail. So for instance, suppose I say animal and I say cat. What's more general, animal or cat? What picks out more things, leaves out details and picks out more things? Animal or cat? You've got it, animal, right? As if you had to picture it, right? Animal would be over here, right? Let me put an A for animal. And there's lots of animals, right? It includes cats, true. All cats are animals, but not all animals are cats. And of course, you could have dogs, right? I'm going to put a little D over here. You could have zebras, and you can have all sorts of other animals, right? So when you're talking about an animal, you're higher up on this hierarchy of abstraction. A here picks out more individuals. Like there's particular things in the universe. When it's all said and done, there are particular cats. Here we are. Let these dots represent particular cats. And there's particular dogs. And there's particular zebras. And there's particulars whatever, right? And there's also particular non-animals, right? Particular chairs and particular plants and all sorts of other stuff that don't fall under the umbrella of the concept animal. But when I'm picking animal as a concept, that concept is more general. So that's what's going to be distinctive about that premise over here. The general principle is going to be worded in such a way that the concepts it's going to utilize are going to be low in terms of resolution, if you will. And as a result, they're going to pick out a lot of things in the world, which is good, right? Because if you want to be able to have principles that apply to multiple situations, but precisely because they're going to be floating in the air, so to speak, they're going to be very far from these dots, this kind of base level reality of the particular things. So what you need you need a particular case. In order to get to this conclusion, this judgment about what you should do, you're going to need more than just this nice slogan. You're going to need the particular case. The particular case is going to have concepts in it that are going to be much closer to the bottom here than to the top. So on the one hand, if you can go up here, more and more abstract, and if you go down, more and more concrete. The particular case is going to have concrete concepts in it. In fact, they're not going to be concepts at all. They're going to pick out specific things. Like for instance, if I name my cat, I had a cat, by the way, for what, 15 years, and her name was, you're going to think it's weird, Cold Cut. But she was cute and I loved her to death. And Cold Cut, that's her name, right? And a particular name picks out one thing and only one thing. So for instance, Damanjit, that's Damanjit's name. It's not anybody else's, right? And so in the particular side of this argument, you're going to get things that pick out individual things. And here you're going to have general things. And the both are going to combine. In addition, the general principle is going to be a normative claim. So you're going to have a should in there, right? A normative claim. And the particular case is going to be a descriptive claim. It's just going to describe the world. And both together are going to come kind of like H2O. You got hydrogen and oxygen, right? And they're going to come together to give you a judgment about what you ought to do. Let's look at a concrete example now. Here's a general principle. A company should fire ill-behaved employees. Now notice the wording here. A company. Which company? Doesn't say. It doesn't specify. And that's the point, right? So this can address any company. Should fire ill-behaved employees. What sort of ill behavior? Well, doesn't specify. Who's the employee? Doesn't mention. Just an employee. So any of the employees, right? So this is picking out a lot of things. A company should fire ill-behaved employees. And of course, like any claim, because that's a claim, you want to ask the one-word question. What's the one-word question that we ask in this class? This one-word question that makes us philosophers, it's the most difficult question you'll ever ask. Why? Pourquoi? Why? Right? So like why? So it sounds great. A company should fire ill-behaved employees. But of course you want to ask why. And if someone answers and provides reasons, and you might provide reasons, whoever provides reasons, those reasons are going to figure in this space above, right? So you need premises in support of this conclusion. Let's just assume here that this has been argued for. So we're just going to not fill up this space, but just want to call your attention to the fact that there's some conceptual real estate there that needs to be filled. There's a logical space there where we'd have to provide an argument for this, but just for the sake of what we're studying right now, let's assume it's been successfully argued for. All right, so fair enough, man. A company should fire ill-behaved employees. Now, that doesn't say much, right? Precisely because it's general. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to graph that to a particular case. Now, you got to bring this down to earth. You got a nice fancy slogan here. Now you got to bring it down to earth. That's where you get the particular case. And again, let's have a look at the particular case here. You can see the distinction. Bob works for Honda. Now, Bob's a particular person, right? Works for Honda. Honda's a particular company, and he's ill-behaved. Here, I haven't filled in his ill behavior, but presumably, whatever, right? You fill it in, be imaginative, but presumably we'd have to flesh that out. But notice here, it's much more specific. Now we're talking about a specific person, a specific company, right? And again, we have to ask whether or not this is true, right? So we want to keep asking why. It's like, is it really the case that Bob works for Honda and he's ill-behaved? But once again, there's some space here where we'd have to justify all that. But let's just assume that this descriptive claim here is true. And notice it's descriptive, right? This is just describing a fact in the world, which can either be true or false. Here, we're going to assume it's true. And here we have a normative claim, right? Should. That's the normative claim over here. Now, when you combine both together, if you accept that a company should fire its ill-behaved employees, and you accept that Bob works for Honda and he's ill-behaved, therefore what? Anybody have a suggestion? Bob's got to go, right? Bob must be fired, right? There's different ways of wording that. I like the should in there because we've already got it. Here's how I'm going to word it, right? So we need an agent. Something's going to do something, right? So we'll hear Honda should fire Bob. And notice here now, we've got the particularity that we had in our particular case, Bob and Honda. That's retained. So there's an element of particularity that carries over here, right? That's terrific. And we've also got the element of normativity that was present in our principle that carries over to our judgment. The should carries over. So we went from just having a description of the world with a recommendation on how to act in the world. But that recommendation follows from a principle, a general principle that we bring to bear on the situation. We're looking at the world in light of the general principle. We're saying, okay, look, this stuff is happening in the world. Bob, he works for Honda and he's ill-behaved. Fair enough. That's something a security camera could see. His behavior is just a piece of, it's an event in the world. It's a brute physical happening, right? What Bob does is just moving his meat around the building, right? That's what doing is. They're events, they're causal, they're just things happening in the world. How should we view that event? Should we say that what Bob's doing is good or bad? Well, it depends by what standard. And then what we do is we consult a standard in order to evaluate Bob's behavior. Here, the standard that we're using is that a company should fire its ill-behaved employees. And all of a sudden, that gives us a way of how we ought to regard Bob's conduct and how we ought to act with respect to Bob's conduct. And here, Honda should fire Bob, right? And that's the basic structure of how moral reasoning happens. Often what tends to happen is folks go from here to here and they don't bother mentioning the principle that they rely on. They just go from the fact to the judgment. But that doesn't work. If you proceed from a fact, right, a particular case, to a judgment, you're doing a move that you can't actually do. You're doing this kind of conversion. You're trying to get H2O out of H, right? Doesn't work. You need something else. And likewise, if you've got a nice sounding slogan, it's not clear what you should do because it's too vague. You can't get to this conclusion. So you need both to collaborate together. Now, part of the work of ethics often is just getting clear on what principles we implicitly rely on. The difference between doing philosophy and having a philosophy is that everyone has a philosophy, right? But they don't actually take the time to state it. Like, what are the principles we rely on? And of course, once we state the principles, then we can start asking why. We can look for this space above. Let's look at another example. General principle. A company should retain its competent employees. Again, let's just take this one for granted. A company should retain its competent employees. And notice I'm picking principles that are perfectly acceptable, at least I find, right? This is a perfectly acceptable principle. A company should fire ill-behaved employees. And here's a perfectly acceptable principle. A company should retain competent employees. Fair enough. Now, again, that's a bit vague. Doesn't tell us much. Let's look at a particular case. Betty works for Toyota and she is competent. So Damanjit suggests that Toyota should retain Betty. What do you think, folks? What should be the conclusion? Toyota should retain Betty? Do you agree? Type in yes if you agree. Damanjit gave us a proposal. Toyota should retain Betty. Certainly, I'm going to agree with you. Right? Notice Damanjit's wording is exactly like my next slide. Right? Toyota should retain Betty. Right? And notice this follows from the premises, right? Of course, this is all conditional on our acceptance of these two premises, but on the assumption that we've agreed to these two premises, then the conclusion follows, right? That Toyota should retain Betty. So you can see here how the general form is the same. So even though earlier we were talking about firing someone, right? And in this situation here, we're talking about retaining someone. And in the previous one, it was Bob and not Betty, and it was Honda and not Toyota. The general structure, this three-part structure, is still the same. Now things get a little trickier, right? So even this is kind of hard compared to ordinary reasoning because we rarely make this explicit. Like I don't think until today anyone took the time to say this out loud. We take this for granted. Of course, if you're competent, then the company should retain you, right? But it's operative in the mere fact that this is going from that, right? So you need to make it explicit. But things get a little trickier. And of course, we're going to be concerned with tricky cases today. Let's look at this situation here. A company should fire ill-behaved employees. Now notice that's exactly word for word the same principle that we encountered earlier, and it's a fairly reasonable one, right? So we agreed that it was fine and we'll take it for granted. So a company should fire ill-behaved employees. Fair enough. A company should retain its competent employees. Oh, terrific. That's another principle that we said was perfectly sensible. And of course, if one is perfectly sensible and the other is perfectly sensible, then you've agreed to both, right? So you can put a plus sign here, the and, right? So you agree to both principles. Fair enough. But now let's direct those two principles, right? Both of them to this particular case. Let's have a look at a particular case. Rajan works for Tesla, and he is both ill-behaved and competent. This is a situation that could totally happen in the world. This wouldn't violate the laws of physics one bit. There's the situation with Rajan. He works for Tesla, and he is both ill-behaved and competent. What should we do about this? What's the judgment based on these premises? This is all the info we have. Yeah. Imagine that this is what we have on the screen right now is all we got to go on. What should be the conclusion? This is where ethics gets tricky. Rajan should be put in probation period. Yeah. Well, Arnav, you're relying on a principle that's not on the screen right now if you say that. You see that? So there's no mention of should, probation, right? So things like that. So you'd have to sort of put that in the mix. And essentially, you've changed the terms of the situation. You see that, Arnav? Like it'd be some, yeah, you're essentially relying on a principle that would say, employees that are at the borderline between good and bad should be put on probation, something like that. You see that? Damanjit writes, Tesla should fire Rajan, but doesn't because he's competent. Yeah, it's not quite clear what to do, right? Look, he is both ill-behaved, right, and competent, like the and. All right, so let's imagine. Let's pause for a moment because this is kind of tricky. Let's imagine they should fire or retain. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of confusing, right? And the right answer is, we don't know. It's not clear, right? That's the correct answer. You know, you can get it. You can make things really simple really quickly. I'm going to have some fun with an airbrush here. Let me airbrush out this principle. So earlier we said this was a good principle. And of course, if you take it on, you take it on all the time. But let's imagine I airbrush out this principle. What should we do? Fire or retain? What should Tesla do? Fire or retain? I dump this principle. You retain. You totally retain, right? But notice now we've restored the flow of the argument, right? We've restored the flow to this judgment merely on account of us ditching a principle that we thought was perfectly acceptable, right? So it's a kind of a fake sense of certainty here. We're kind of refusing to acknowledge that we thought this principle was worthwhile. It was in our toolkit as moral agents. We walked around the world believing this principle a moment ago, right? That was the principle that got us to fire Bob. But all of a sudden we decide, it's bothersome, and we restore the flow. But we all agree, if this were the situation now, what's on the screen, that the conclusion would smoothly follow. Do we all agree? Type in agree if you agree, question if you've got a question. Like, if this was the situation. But like, this is disingenuous, right? This is not the situation we're confronting. It's disingenuous to pretend that we don't have this principle. We have that principle. We thought it was worthwhile. So this is not good. Hey, look, let's have some fun again with the airbrush. What about this? If I no, you can't just do that, right? That's right. It's disingenuous. You can't just, if a principle was worth taking on, it's worth taking on, and then you keep it, right? So yeah, Arnav, you're right. You can't do the move I'm doing right now. That's a dumb move, right? Let's do another dumb move, Arnav. Let's imagine I just ditched this principle. What should be the judgment? Tesla should fire or retain, Rajan? Fire or retain? Fire, of course. But then again, notice this is all this kind of fake sense of certainty that we've restored is only happening because we've made this situation, we've doctored it into an easier situation than it actually is. Let's have some fun with the airbrush once again. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to airbrush the particular case. So I've said here that Rajan works for Tesla and he's both ill-behaved and competent. I'm going to go and I'm going to remove some words here, and I'm going to say that he's, let me just try to do this nice and clean. All right, here we go. Rajan works for Tesla and he's ill-behaved. What's the conclusion? Fire or retain? Of course, fire. I agree. Right? If that were the case, if only that were the case, quite literally, right? If only that was the case. But that requires you once again to sort of be dishonest, right? Because part of what you want in philosophy as a seeker of wisdom, that's literally what philosophy is. It's the search for wisdom, philosophia. Philo is lover and Sophia is wisdom, is to acknowledge the truth. You have to acknowledge the truth of the principles that you thought were worthwhile, all of them at once, and you also have to acknowledge the world that you confront. And so you can't just decide to pretend that Rajan's not competent. He is competent. Let's do a final, have some fun with the airbrush. Let's imagine, for instance, I airbrush that he's ill-behaved, and I just keep this. Right? Rajan works for Tesla and he is competent. What's the judgment? Fire or retain? Retain. Absolutely. Right? Now notice how we can easily get a false sense of moral certainty if we are dishonest. And I mean this in the sense that we pretend to not know what we know. Right? If you pretend to not know what you know, or pretend to sort of, because you want to escape the difficulty that you're confronting. But I want all of us to look at this in the face. This is a moral conundrum. It's a difficult one. And the only proper answer is, I don't know, and it's not clear. Now, of course, then what that means is you got to go back to the drawing board. You have to re-examine your premises. And that means you could either re-examine the merit of these principles. You might want to decide to spend some time above each one of those principles and start investigating whether or not they were worth taking on. So you might want to go and spend some time here. You might also want to ask, well, did I get my description of the world right? But imagine that you did that and everything's fine. You really have justified this principle and everything's fine and you've justified this principle. And really, Rajan could be like that. Like a person who's ill-behaved and competent, it's not like a square circle. Like I can't find a square circle. There's no Frisbee that's a square circle. It's both square and circular. You're not going to find that at Home Depot. There's no such thing. But a person who's competent and ill-behaved, that doesn't violate the laws of physics or logic one bit. So imagine you really have this situation. You have to stand ready to acknowledge that some situations are not clear. And most of the cases that we're interested in ethics are precisely show up on our radar as philosophers because they're hard. The easy cases don't show up on our radar because they're easy. It's like, yeah, okay, they're no-brainers. The hard ones are the tough ones. And philosophy, if you look at the literature in ethics, so everything that's written in ethics, it's mainly concerned with the really, really tough ones, especially in this branch of a sub-branch of ethics called applied ethics. And that's what we're going to be doing today.